Hello everyone. This is day 33 of our series 75 Days of Partition. I'm Aprajita, a story scholar with the 1947 Partition Archive. This initiative is meant to commemorate 75 years of partition. It started on June 3rd and it will go on till 17th August, historically when the Radcliffe Award was declared. It has been my absolute honor to host amazing speakers on this platform. Today, also, we have a very special guest, Sharika Parma. She is an independent researcher. She did her MA in Modern History from JNU Delhi. She has also received an online certification for the course Introduction to Digital Humanities by Harvard University. She has also been recipient of 2021 Tata Trust 1947 Partition Archive Research Grant. During that time, she analyzed experiences of partition refugees settled in West Punjab. Interestingly, she has handled social media engagement for the upcoming documentary by Bani Singh, tracing memories of India's 1948 Olympic hockey gold won against the backdrop of partition. She has curated book list for children aged 5 to 17 years for the History Read program by Mindworth Inc. With her kind of scholarship on partition, it is befitting that we have called upon her today to talk about this longing for home by those who resettled after partition. Welcome, Sharika. It's so nice to have you here today.
Thank you, Prajita. I'm delighted to be here and quite excited.
So Sharika, tell me about your, starting with the first question, like your experience with the archive and how this research question originated while you were doing your research, your research question about home, cities, and partition, and how you were correlating them all together.
All right. So I was aware of the archive for quite a few years. And in 2021, I got the opportunity to work with the archive as a Tata Trust Partition Archive research grantee. So that is when I proposed a project to them, stating that I would want to work on a project called Home City Partition. And that would look at the idea of home for partition refugees that had moved from West Punjab and resettled in the city of Chandigarh on the Indian side of Punjab. So that's how it started. And I could go into a bit of detail about how I reached there. It's all tied up with the research question, how I reached my research question, which is could answer it in two parts. So first, I partly belong to Chandigarh. My father's side of the family moved to Chandigarh after the partition. So they resettled there, and that is my connection. The second is actually when I, it was during my master's when I started research that I started looking at the city of Chandigarh. I wanted to understand how did the early development years of the city looked like. And during that period, I understood how a majority of its inhabitants, its early inhabitants, were people who had been resettled in the city after after partition. And it's quite interesting. So it came up. The city came up in the early '60s, and it was conceptualized late '50s, coming up early '60s. It was not a city where partition refugees moved to directly in the late '40s and the '50s. A lot of stories of the people who moved and eventually resettled in Chandigarh. They reached there after multiple pit stops. People were in Shimla, they were in Jalandhar, of course Amritsar. So a lot of them have reached there after numerous, almost jumping or moving from city to city, and almost then finally coming and settling in Jammu. So that's how my interest in this topic came about. And I was very interested in understanding histories of spaces, particularly urban spaces, cities. And I had worked on forced migration as well during my master's. I worked on the 1990 Kashmiri Pandit exodus. And so my research around forced migrations and cities. It all came together when the Partition Archive and Tata Trust sent out this call for grantees, and I said that I want to do this.
That sounds very interesting, indeed. First, dealing with the topic of the exodus of the Kashmiri pandits, and then coming to Chandigarh, and looking at the resettlement of all these partition refugees. So, what was the main motive? Since you say it was a new city, and a lot of them came after moving around to a lot of cities. What became the motive of them coming here in Chandigarh to this new city?
For a lot of residents, it was the allotment of houses on the Indian side. So we know about evacuee properties. We in that journey, it's also about a lot of people who held properties on either side of the borders. They they were compensated in a way, not all of them, but some, and a huge section of that also happened in Chandigarh. So that is definitely one of the motives for resettling there. And the second is tied up with the idea of Chandigarh itself when it was created. It was supposed to be a new city for a new India, a modern city, an organized city. It was about a new start. And I think that is also how people were drawn to it. So both these motives.
So during your research time, you were Tata Trust 1947 research grantee, right? But keeping in mind that this archive is digital, and digital humanities is all rage
Yeah.
nowadays. Research in digital humanities. So please share your analysis of its advantages and shortcomings, if any, that you faced during your time.
All right. So this was the first time I was working with such an expansive digital archive. I'd looked at the Delhi archive, which has the Abhilekh portal before, but this was the first time I was accessing for a longer period a digital archive. And whenever I dove into the research project, and alongside I was also noticing my own engagement with the archive while looking at the different oral testimonies, which were video testimonies that are housed in the archive. I i kept trying to think about how is this experience different from walking, say, the halls of the Central Secretariat Library, which I had accessed earlier which was a physical archive for a previous research. And I'm extremely interested in the method of history, in the discipline of history. How is it that we do it? So whenever I either read or I conduct some research myself, it's important for me to understand the method that I'm engaging in. So I did a report for the Partition Archive in which I talked about the longing of home. I talked about what I found in the oral testimonies, this idea of a longing for home being explored through dreams and how it reflects, and of course, how the impact and violence of partitioning gets expressed in ways such as aversions that people develop because these are traumatic experiences. And alongside that, I did a section on the oral history and as methodology and the digital archive. So I was I was trying to sort of compare the two experiences of a physical archive and a digital archive. And one thing for sure is that accessing a digital archive felt more mediated to me. For instance, when I worked with the archive, it was definitely in liaison with the project manager, with the archivists, with the librarians in the Indian universities. So it was a collaborative process and it was mediated. I could have been very easily left alone wandering a physical archive after I'd been given permission to go in and search for certain records. But here, my first point of contact was the team at the archive, and then the second point of mediation was that would be the software. It's your search software. So actually, the search works doubly because it's the search for home that the partition survivors had, but for me, it also turned out to be the search through a digital archive. So um, it felt a little more removed because I had to go through multiple people, and I also had to go through a search process which I couldn't, it wasn't hands on. So I became interested in trying to understand how is it that these search softwares might be guiding our process of finding materials in the archive, and that led me to concepts of metadata, and that is what got me interested in digital humanities even more. So I have that's how that course comes in, and um, hopefully will be concluding soon. So these are the few bits that I have so far.
I'm amazed by the kind of the democratic process that the archive has introduced, because it is so accessible to each and every citizen that they can pursue their independent researches, and in spite of working so remotely, they are so well connected. That is what is I look at it as the most amazing thing about it.
Absolutely. I just wanted to add a point. Um, my grant period coincided with COVID. So we were all working remotely, and the teams were connected in India and in the US and across cities. So a lot of it was made possible because of the online nature of the work. And so many researchers in universities across countries had to turn to digital archives. It was a sudden shift because research had to be done, courses were ongoing, and we couldn't do archival work. We couldn't go on field trips. So many people turned to digital archives or digitized sources, and it just made me think about how it's not just the it's we were we're just moving towards so much of digitized source work. And how is it that I was wondering that do we train our historians for it, because this is the future. So you have digitized sources and you have born digital sources. For instance, with the 1947 partition archive, they were created, these sources are created in the digital format. So how do we access them? How are we training our future historians or present historians for working with this, and at what scale? So that's just it. All of this came to me when you were commenting.
So hearing about your, such an interesting topic, it makes me, curious that what were your findings actually? What were you able to analyze and conclude about the search for home in the narratives or testimonies of all these partition witnesses?
All right. So it ended up being almost 3, 4 different points. Um, when I tried to understand the oral testimonies, of course, there was this entire element of longing. But when the partition survivors they were talking about their experience, whether they talked about their childhood or they talked about moving, as they did that, it was interesting for me to see 2, 3 points. The first related to space. So a lot of them would describe their homes. They would describe their neighborhoods, the streets. People would talk about where they could go, where they couldn't go, especially women. They would say, "Oh, all right, we would be accompanied by someone," or um, if you were to visit the bazaar. And the entire idea of your home being not just your house, but your neighborhood, your city, the the childhood streets you grew up in, all of that became even more prominent. So that is something that I wish to explore. For instance, particularly this idea that when women survivors were asked about their home, I found a couple asking for clarification, saying which home, मेरी शादी के पहले या शादी के बाद में, and it it's a very simple observation, but or a simple comment, but you understand that the experiences of partition were so varied, not across gender, of course, but across classes. So the main a lot of the survivors' testimonies that I got access to, a lot of them were middle class, and so a lot of middle class women were talking about the kind of lives they led, the kind of restrictions they might have had, or not. So that was one thing. The second set of findings um, was around trauma expressed through aversions and dreams. So, as a story scholar yourself, you would have heard about so many people talking about the dreams that they had. So there was this entire aspect of so many survivors often dreaming about visiting their home. They would um, they would be roaming the streets. They describe in detail कि मैं यहाँ चली गई, फिर मैं वहाँ चली गई, ऐसे almost कि हम भटक रहे थे वहाँ पर. And the most interesting thing that stayed with me was that one of the survivors, actually, the whose testimony I was able to view. uh, she said she got a chance to visit her home after partition, several decades after partition, in Lahore. And she said something very interesting. She said, I would always dream of going back home. And after I visited Lahore, I never dreamt of it again. And this was, hearing these stories, they make you stand still and reflect for a moment. It was, um, you know, someone who got a chance to go home had a kind of, they were able to make peace with something. But the other survivors I would listen to, they would talk about how this continued and this never stopped for them. Um, some talked about how they couldn't look at a particular type of food because it reminded them of so much carnage that had been undertaken. So, the entire psychological aspect of the kind of impact that it left people with for years and years, that continues even today, that is the story of partition. I'm sure you work on partition literature, and um, everyone talks about Manto, and this is something that comes across so viscerally um, in their writing. So this was the second thing, and the third thing, the third set of things was that um, oral history and digital archive. These are methodologies and transformations that are occurring in our world, and we are not entirely adept at as historians yet to deal with them. And we need to be training more. We need to be understanding these processes more, and there needs to be a much more interdisciplinary outlook, even at our undergrad level, for being able, for bringing together bringing together the social sciences and information technology in these processes. Because, as you know, when you step into research at higher levels, it's all interdisciplinary, and your questions lead you everywhere, and then you're not bound by just what a discipline allows for. So these are the things, and this is actually a continuing project. So I will come back to you hopefully with even more answers. You're from now maybe.
Your findings are, each concluding is very interesting. But I have something, similar to say to your first findings, that your idea about home, it means something more than just the bricks and the walls that were contained that made part of their house. It was more like their neighborhood. So often asked this question to the partition survivors, like how much of their homes do they remember? Do they miss it? Do they ever wish to go back? And I've received, very diverse replies to these. But I think those who attach the better part of their childhood memories in a faraway land where they could not ever possibly go back. So they felt a greater sense of loss of home, culture, identity. And I got to know about all these places in West Punjab after I heard them say it, but they remember it like the back of their hands, and they would describe it like, that Gurdwara nearby, the markets, their schools. And this map of longing that is created is etched in their memories. And I think those images will stay till they close their eyes. That is what I want to say about your first finding.
Definitely. And you put it so well that these images stay with them. And when they speak about them to their grandchildren and to story scholars, it leaves us with an image of a place that we have not been to. But it's it's so it's so clearly, it just forms in front of our eyes. Um, and this happens very interestingly with a lot of forced migrations. So that's the parallel I could draw between the exodus and here. For instance, I have a history of migration from the other side as well, and I could tell you about what our ancestral house looked like and what the streets were, who lived across us, and on which floor, on the back side of the house, in the front, which corners were occupied by whom, and it's all of that stays, and it stays for not just the survivors; it stays for the future generations who
Yeah.
get to hear about it.
Yes, that's very true. So it has been very delightful to talk to you today, Sharika. Thank you for coming and sharing your valuable research findings. Uh, we will come back tomorrow with the esteemed author, Dr. Salman Rashid, at the same time. Please keep showing your love and support by sending us a like and heart emojis. Keep tuning in. Till that time, take care. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.